I recently made a video reviewing this Pine64 Pinecil soldering iron, and I said, in my opinion, it was the best portable soldering iron pretty much at any price, although it comes in at a really amazingly good price. But that price comes with a few drawbacks, and I did not expect how many of you guys would feel that the drawbacks of this iron actually were a deal breaker, even at its extremely low price. And some of you guys prefer the original TS100. So in this video, I bought a TS100 to go up against my Pinecil, and we're going to look at the two of them and see where the TS100 is better, where the Pinecil is better, and which one might be best for you. I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. And the most obvious difference between these irons is going to start with their size and shape. The TS100 and the Pinecil are just about the same height as each other, but the Pinecil is noticeably thicker. And some people feel that that makes it more comfortable in the hand. Other people feel that they prefer the thinner profile of the TS100, and you're gonna have to think about which one of those you are. To me, I like the thicker one better, if I'm speaking for myself. The TS100 is rated for 12 to 24 volts and can pull up to 65 watts, whereas the Pinecil can only go up to 21 volts and only pulls up to 60 watts. Now that 5-watt difference probably doesn't make much difference in your daily life, but the higher voltage input of the TS100 definitely matters, especially if you are a quadcopter pilot flying 6S batteries, which many people are. It is a known fact that the TS100, although it's only rated for 24 volts, can run off a fully charged 6S battery and does not take any damage. Whereas the Pinecil's 21 volt limit is a hard limit. You can run it off a 5S battery. Who's got 5S batteries? Or, well, that's it. Or you can't run it off a 6S battery. It will be damaged internally if you do that. And that means that if you absolutely insist on running the soldering iron off of your flight packs, then the TS100 is going to be the one for you. The USB port here is a potential workaround for the voltage input limit on the Pinecil. It can be powered from USB-C PD. And some people have missed in my original review that it's not just any USB-C charger, but specifically a high wattage, high voltage USB-C PD charger that can do it. It will power up from a standard USB charger, but it won't actually be able to solder unless it gets a minimum of 12 volts, and it prefers 20 volts. I hoped when I first got this iron that I would be able to find an easy XT60 to USB PD sort of conversion device to let me run it off my flight packs. But I've been searching and I cannot find such a thing. If you know of such a thing that exists, put it down in the comments and I'll definitely check it out. Of course, the TS100 also has a USB port, but it is not for powering the iron, it's just for firmware updates. Now, both the Pinecil and the TS100 use the same barrel plug to power up, and it is a 5 by 2.5 millimeter barrel plug, not the 5 by 2.1 millimeter that is much more common. So you will need to buy a special plug or a special power adapter in order to do it. That is true for both the TS100 and the Pinecil. It might surprise you if you were planning to use a pre-existing like 12 volt or 19 volt adapter that you've got laying around. As far as the firmware goes, you might well think that the Pinecil wins because it's got a more sophisticated firmware. But it turns out that the firmware that the Pinecil ships with is an open source firmware that you can also put on the TS100. And it's not that complicated to do. Let's go over to the computer and I'll show you how to do it. The firmware for the iron is available on GitHub because of course it is, and I'll put a link down in the video description. And the way to flash it is, the instructions are right here. You hold the button down closest to the tip, that's the A button, and then while holding it down, you plug in USB. A new removable drive will pop up in your computer. And then we will go to the releases page, find the latest version, download ts100.zip because our iron is a TS100. We'll open that up. Each of these is for a different language. We're going to go with EN, English. We will then just drag that hex file onto the removable drive, and that will flash it to the iron. And when that's done successfully, that file will be replaced by another file named ts100en.rdy. Ready means that the flash is complete. And with that done, you can now see that the TS100 also has the same fancy schmancy firmware that the Pinecil ships with from the factory. Not too difficult. Now there is one thing that Pinecil can do that the TS100 will never be able to do, and that is the Pinecil has a RISC-IV processor in it, whereas the TS100 has, I believe it's an STM32 processor, just like most of our flight controllers and some of our ESCs. There is a way to use the Pinecil soldering iron as a RISC-IV breakout board, so you can do RISC-IV things with it. And there are some people in the world who feel that that's a big deal, but most people, I think, watching this probably are as confused as I am about what that's good for and don't see that as a selling point. Next, I want to look at the heating performance of these irons, because the lower voltage and lower wattage of the Pinecil may have an effect, or it may not. To test the heating performance, I've got a fully charged 5S battery, 21.1 volts, and we're just going to plug it in, and we're going to set the iron to 450 and see what it makes of that. And we'll start with the Pinecil, 450, okay. And away we go. We can see the tip temperature right here. You can see the input is 20.9 volts, 20.8 volts. So we're getting the maximum possible input voltage. And of course the battery is capable of all the watts that you could possibly want. And we see that it seems to be intentionally slowing down when it hits about 400 Celsius. I wonder if it wants to do like the power boost thing that it does, where if you hold down the plus key, it boosts up. Sure seems like there's a setting in here somewhere. Power source 5S, correct. Soldering settings. Boost temp 450. Power limit off. Oh man, I don't know. Why is it not? Boost! Boost, you son of a beast! Let's see what the TS100 does. So I'm going to start out by powering the TS100 on the same 21 volt input just to see what happens. We'll crank that up to 450. Okay, and let's see what she do. We're pulling 50 watts at 20.1 volts. And it's doing the same thing. The TS100 is doing the same thing. It's just kind of hovering. It's not going to 450. Good news, I found the answer. There is a discussion thread on the GitHub repo for this firmware where the developer says basically that about 410, 420 degrees is as hot as the iron is capable of measuring. So although you can set it to 450, it can't actually go up to 450 because it maxes out the sensor. Whether that's something that could be fixed in firmware, I don't know. And why the iron definitely went to 450, or at least appeared to go to 450 on older firmware, I don't know. But the takeaway is that it is an issue that affects the firmware running on both of these irons, and therefore isn't a distinguishing point between them. Well, there's one more thing we got to talk about before we decide which of these irons is the best one for you, and that is the price. And the price of these irons is significantly different. The TS100, I can't find it for less than about $60, and sometimes it's more than that. Whereas the Pinecil iron can be had for as little as $25 from the Pine64 website, and more typically you'll find it sold for around $35 wherever else you might find it. So the Pinecil is about half the price, maybe a little bit less, than the TS100. There's no doubt that the TS100 has some advantages, most specifically the ability to take a 6S battery input that are going to make it appealing for many FPV pilots. But if you are capable of working around the input voltage limit of the Pinecil, there's no question that it is a hell of a good value, and the ability to take USB power input certainly is. If you have a USB power bank that can do USB PD, that might be a selling point for you. The other thing we got to acknowledge is that the TS100 is widely available in Asia and Europe, whereas the Pine64 seems to pretty much ship from the USA. At least that's what I heard from some commenters on my original video. And the shipping from the USA to elsewhere in the world pretty much negates any price advantage that it might have over the TS100. Whichever of these you've decided is right for you, there are links down in the video description where you can pick them up. They are affiliate links, and that means when you make any purchase after you click that link, I get a small commission. It's an easy way for you to support the channel. Whenever you do your shopping, click the link, do your shopping, check out, I get a little commission. I sure do appreciate it. Well, did I get it right this time? Well, I have to have gotten it right because I covered both of them. I still think that the Pine 64 is going to be the winner for a lot of people because of its extremely low price and because the input voltage is something that you can work around in various ways. But if the price isn't a downside for you, the TS100 is also very, very good. Happy flying.
What are you doing in here? The least you could do is subscribe or join my Patreon or, like, just here's another video I picked out for you. Jeez.